Let's break down 4 running backs and 4 wide receivers set to go absolutely nuclear in week 9 of 2024 fantasy football. The upside is way too high this week for these players. Their matchups are way too good, so make sure these players are not on your bench as we approach the week. So let's kick the video off with DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, who's been playing absolutely lights out for the past couple weeks, been playing absolutely out of his mind. He has a smash matchup this week against the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the running back position, and they just got absolutely torched this past week by Devonta Smith for 26.7 fantasy points, 6 catches, a touchdown through the air, 50 receiving yards, 97 yards on the ground, as well as giving up 2 rushing touchdowns to Raheem Mostert. So Swift is in a great spot this week against the Arizona Cardinals on the road here, but I'm not worried about that. The Bears on the road this past week, and Swift still had 18.9 fantasy points against the Washington Commanders. He's had a touchdown in 4 straight games, 18.9 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. He's the true workhorse running back for the Chicago Bears team. I know Roschon Johnson gets some of those goal line touches, which is annoying, but ultimately it's not impacting Swift too negatively from a fantasy impact, obviously, with what we've seen in the past 4 games. He's the RB16 in fantasy football right now. He's averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game, but I have seen a lot of rosters out there where Swift is coming in as an RB3 or 4 for some of you guys who are fortunate and haven't been hit by this awful injury bug this year. So if Swift is one of these players who might be on your bench at times, might be a flex play at times, no matter what, here in week 9 against the Cardinals, make sure he is in your starting lineups. He's going to have an absolutely monster week. I am sprinting over to Underdog to take the over on DeAndre Swift's total rushing yards, sitting at just 65.5 rushing yards right now. He has smashed that in every single game in the last 4 weeks. I also don't mind him to score a touchdown this week, as he's also done that in the past 4 weeks. Great matchup this week. I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Swift's rushing yards. All new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are going to receive a free NFL Pick Em on Underdog this week. Take your free Pick Em, pair it with DeAndre Swift's over on the rushing yards. Once that line hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 as long as you sign up with promo code TheCatch. Next up is Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers, coming off of a down game, which we expected against the Denver Broncos, who going into last week were giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, and finished with just 9.1 fantasy points, but had 15 touches for 56 yards on the ground, 2 receptions, and 15 total receiving yards. He's still the RB15 so far on the season, averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game, and he might go into this week 9 matchup a little bit hesitant because we've gotten news that Bryce Young is going to be the starting quarterback for the Panthers again here in week 9, as he was in week 8. And in games where Bryce Young has been the starting quarterback, we've seen a much lower ceiling for Chuba Hubbard and essentially for this entire offense. But Bryce Young did look a little bit better, I think, than expected against the Broncos last week, although he did throw 2 interceptions. But the main thing here is the matchup. This New Orleans Saints run defense has just been awful the past couple of weeks, becoming one of the worst run defenses in the NFL. They just gave up a big day to J.K. Dobbins on the ground this past week, allowing 16.8 fantasy points, 57 yards on the ground, 4 catches, and a touchdown. So I think that Chuba's in a good spot this week against the Saints. It's a home game for the Panthers. I do think that he can come out and have one of these higher ceiling games, 15-plus fantasy points. So if you're worried about Chuba Hubbard this week, I think he's actually in a very good spot. Don't worry too much here. I think Chuba is going to explode for another high ceiling fantasy game in week 9. Next up is my guy Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, who are giving up the 23rd most fantasy points per game. Now, When we look at Chase Brown, the last 2 weeks have been a little bit lower ceilings overall, but he's faced two tough run defenses in the Cleveland Browns and the Philadelphia Eagles. Struggled a bit on the ground last week, but also the game script didn't benefit Chase Brown. He did score a touchdown, did have 32 yards on the ground, but just 2.67 yards per carry, 2.93 yards per carry in week 7 against Cleveland. But the important thing here is he is still out touching Zach Moss by quite a bit. 5 touches on the ground for Moss this past week compared to 12 for Chase Brown. The week before that, 6 to Zach Moss and 15 to Chase Brown. And this is a much different matchup this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, who have been struggling against the running back position, to say the least. They were a little bit better this past week, but still gave up 59 yards and a touchdown to Kareem Hunt at home. So I still think that Chase Brown is a very strong start this week, a very safe start. He's still averaging double-digit fantasy points per game on the season so far. And just don't forget, we're not that far removed from 3 games in a row where he had 14 or more fantasy points and a ceiling of 23 fantasy points. So if you need to roll out Chase Brown this week, I think he's a very strong start, a very good flex play. Don't let him sit on your bench as we move into week 9. Last running back I want to talk about is Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans, who's been very consistent throughout this entire season, averaging 14.2 fantasy points per game. And in his last 4 starts, he's had 14 or more fantasy points in 3 out of those 4 games. The down week against the Buffalo Bills in week 7, very disappointing and a good matchup there. But this past week, even in that blowout game against the Detroit Lions, against one of the best run defenses in the NFL, he still had 14.7 fantasy points, 94 yards on the ground, 4.7 yards per carry, and added 3 catches for 23 receiving yards. So I will note going into the week, he is now listed as questionable, dealing with a foot injury, but the Titans are optimistic that he'll be able to play this week, and I think they're going to push for him to play because Tajay Spears is also banged up. And as long as he plays, this is a fantastic matchup against the New England Patriots run defense, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. This defense is just really fallen back overall, and they struggle heavily against the run. So Pollard, another one of these running backs, might hang out in the flex area, might be your RB2, might be a player that you consider other players over on a weekly basis, whatever. He's the RB22 so far on the season. Like I said, averaging over 14 fantasy points per game so far on the season. He's a strong start this week against an awful Patriots run defense. As long as he is healthy, he should be in your starting lineups going into week 9. Next up, we got Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. And, I mean, you guys know I try to stay away from Thursday night matchups for the most part, but I just think Garrett Wilson is a super strong start on a weekly basis. And I still think there's kind of some paranoia around Garrett Wilson where fantasy managers are scared about him, and I don't get it. He's a top 10 fantasy football wide receiver. He's averaging 15.9 fantasy points per game. He only has a single-digit performance on the season once in week 4 against the Denver Broncos, against Pat Surtain. He's had 13 or more fantasy points in his last 4 games with a ceiling of 29 fantasy points. And 2 of those starts included Devonta Adams on this team, so nothing to worry about when it comes to Devonta Adams being on this team. 9 targets in week 7 for Adams, 9 for Garrett Wilson, 6 this past week for Adams, 8 for Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson still acting as the primary wide receiver 1 on this team, as he is leading the team in the last 2 weeks in receptions, targets, and total receiving yards. So don't be worried about Garrett Wilson. And I know it's a short week. Like I said, I don't even like Thursday night matchups, but you can't bench Garrett Wilson. And this Houston Texans defense is struggling against the pass, playing well against the run, not playing well against the pass. And the Jets, I mean, they're not very good. Don't get me wrong. But that keeps them in competitive game scripts where they need to throw the football. So it's a good thing from a fantasy perspective. So it's a good matchup. Wilson has been balling. He's been great. Keep him in your starting lineups. Don't overthink it as we go into week 9. Next up is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, coming off a game against the Carolina Panthers where he had 17.1 fantasy points, 11 targets, 8 catches, 100 receiving yards against a very bad Panthers defense. But man, this Baltimore Ravens defense he gets in week 9 is not impressing me whatsoever. This secondary is playing almost non-existent. They're giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. I mean, they have been dreadful to watch. They might be a good defense against the run. They're not good against opposing wide receivers, opposing tight ends, or opposing quarterbacks when it comes to fantasy points scored. So Courtland Sutton should be locked and loaded into your starting lineup. I know he had the goose egg in week 7, the bad performance against the Raiders, who have been surprisingly good against wide receivers in week 5. But you take out those two performances since week 3, he's at 13.8 or more fantasy points in every single game since week 3, with a ceiling of 17.1 fantasy points this past week. So nothing to fear when it comes to Courtland Sutton this week. Like I said, the Ravens not playing well against quarterbacks. I think Bo Nix's going to have a solid week. I think Courtland Sutton's going to benefit from that. And ultimately, I still expect the Ravens to play better than the Broncos in this game. So this should provide for a good game script where the Broncos need to throw the football. So Courtland Sutton, a very solid flex option with tons of upside due to this matchup going into week 9. Next up, we got my boy Devonta Smith. I told you guys last week, go out and buy low on Devonta Smith. If you can get a deal on Devonta Smith after that 0.8 performance in week 7, do it, because he's going to bounce back in week 8 against the Bengals, and that's exactly what happened. This is just part of the Devonta Smith experience. He gives you that goose egg, super, super low floor game every single year. Go back and check. You'll find them. But outside of that, he's super consistent. 20.5 fantasy points against the Bengals in week 8. A great touchdown catch, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 85 receiving yards. And this week, he gets the Jacksonville Jaguars, arguably the worst defense in the entire NFL. They're giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. He is in a smash spot this week. I know some of you guys are going to say, well, I always start, it's Devonta Smith. Trust me, not everybody always starts Devonta Smith. He's the wide receiver 31 on the season, had the essential goose egg in week 7, missed week 4, was on bye week in week 5. Feels a little bit up and down for Devonta Smith, but it really has not been. Outside of those 3 weeks, he has had 14.9 or more fantasy points in every single game, averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's a model of consistency. When it comes to PPR scoring formats, he's a great option this week. He could have his best fantasy performance of the whole season going up against this Jaguars defense at home. Absolutely do not bench Devonta Smith going into week 9. I'm also heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Devonta Smith's total receiving yards, sitting at just 57.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in every single game he's played in this year, except for week 7 against the Giants. And now he gets this incredible matchup against the Jags. Don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are getting that free NFL Pick Em this week. Take your free Pick Em, take the over on Devonta Smith's total receiving yards. Once those hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Last but not least is Josh Downs, who's going to face the Minnesota Vikings here in week 9 on Sunday Night Football. And I will note that he is going into the week listed as questionable, dealing with a toe injury. We'll see what happens here, but I think he's expected to play. We'll find out. He's coming off a performance against the Texans, 22.2 fantasy points, 9 targets, 4 receptions, 109 receiving yards, a touchdown, had that big catch in that game. Don't get me wrong, take away that catch, the stat line's not as good, but he got the catch, so who cares, right? We go back since week 4. He's been balling. I mean, 15.9 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 7 against Miami, where he had a dud, but Miami's been one of the best, if not the best, pass defense in the whole NFL. We know the story at quarterback here. It's been up and down, but we got Joe Flacco this week. We got a primetime game. We got a Minnesota Vikings defense that really struggles in terms of their secondary, and Downs has been very good overall, averaging 14.4 fantasy points on the season. He's a strong start this week as long as he's healthy. He's got tons of upside due to this matchup. Joe Flacco's back. Like I said, we should be in the clear to fire up Josh Downs this week and expect a high ceiling in this matchup in week 9. That'll do it for today's video. There are 4 running backs, 4 wide receivers that you cannot bench this week because they are going to go nuclear. They need to be in your starting lineup. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below if you guys need anything whatsoever as we move into week 9 of 2024 fantasy football. Be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get all the comments cleared before Thursday Night Football. If you guys watch this after Thursday Night Football, I'll get all the comments cleared before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, guys, we're going to have all the content you could possibly need here on the channel in week 9 to help you guys bring home a dub. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.